Hello everyone and welcome to Module 11, Developing and Communicating Frontline COVID-19 Training. First and foremost, as we get into this presentation, what do we mean by frontline COVID-19 training? Well, there's been a lot of changes from March of 2020 to June of 2021, which is when we're currently recording this presentation. So what training looks like may have adjusted for your facility over time. Initially, during the beginning of the pandemic, the training probably focused a lot on information about the virus and how to protect yourself from the virus. And since then, there's been a lot of policies that have changed, both in your facility and from a regulatory standpoint. And there's also been a lot of changes just in how we're communicating that information. So the key messages we want to go through in this module are training to a moving target, because essentially that's what we're doing, and we'll get into that. General guidelines for training, and knowing your audience. But overall, we really want to be gaining buy-in on the mitigation practices that your facility has adopted. So you want your employees to be in on the big picture with you as much as possible. There's one question that's important to reflect on before we get into the rest of this content, and that is the question of, is your facility currently doing training for people on COVID-19 information and policies? So again, like I mentioned on the previous slide, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was probably a lot of communication about the virus and the biology of it and what to expect and what we knew and what we didn't know. And now we're at the point where policies are changing so quickly, again, both internally and externally in the surrounding community, that you might have let training and that background information fall by the wayside. So keep in mind that training is still something that can be valuable in how you communicate your resources and your mitigation practices to your employees when we move forward. So keep in mind the concept of training versus just delivering a policy to your employees and saying this is what we're doing, because those are two different things. Training involves providing some background information on the reason why we're doing what we're doing. So as things have developed over the course of the pandemic, industry has had to respond to that, and that's really resulted in us training to a moving target. So the control strategies that we've adopted at facilities have, changed over time, and there's a reason for that, and that's because we've learned more about the virus as time has progressed. So that's caused a shift in how we do control for the virus. But that makes having employee buy-in all the more critical, because if we're just changing policies on them without explaining the reasons why we're doing that, that can really eat up a positive culture in the plant and can make people feel discouraged, and especially when this pandemic is something that people are both dealing with in a personal and professional setting. So making sure that we are explaining things to the best of our ability is going to be super important. So when you're delivering new policies based on this moving target and the new information that comes out, or the fact that vaccinations are obtainable now, we need to be explaining how we arrived at our decisions when we adopt new practices or procedures that change from the last practice or procedure that we had. So this may require that you're giving that background material, that kind of the material that we gave at the onset of the pandemic, with how did we arrive at this decision and why. So in order for employees to understand why we've changed our policy, or the thinking behind why we made our policy, it's important that we're communicating that information as best as possible, and not just saying, okay, you have to wear a mask now, and expecting them to do so without scratching their heads and asking themselves why. So it's really important that we're doing our best to incorporate that training piece, and that may include topics such as what we've learned about the virus transmission or vaccination adoption, or what's going on in the outside community in the local area. So keep those things in mind. As far as general guidelines go for training, it's really important. It's kind of ironic, we're training to a moving target, and here on my slide I have consistency. But we really need to be as consistent as possible in the communication of the current expectations at that given point. So this is something to think about here is, are the policies that we've adopted enforced consistently across all supervisors and managers? Because nothing can break down a work team faster than if there's inconsistent communication across the different departments or across, different shifts. So it's really important that we have our management team on the same page and have them communicating current expectations to the rest of the employees. And also be clear on why these practices were chosen. So that may involve training the supervisors and managers on your team on, how to deal with employee questions on why we're adjusting a certain policy. So you may need to back up and explain and retrain folks on the reason why this policy is important. And then communicate that all strategies are risk management tools and not risk elimination tools. So, the concept here is that you could be struck by lightning when you're inside. Is that likely? No, not at all, but it's possible. And in this pandemic, that's been something that we've struggled with, and in previous modules, we talk about risk. And all of our mitigation practices depend on what we think the risk level is of certain things. So mask adoption versus vaccinations versus sanitizing frequently touched surfaces are all things that need to be evaluated on, where are we getting the most bang for our buck on our mitigation practices. So when we communicate that to employees, it's generally something that employees can understand, but it's not communicated well, typically speaking. So we need to work on that when we're developing our training program and communicating new policies. It's definitely important to call out that guidance will change, and it has changed and it will continue to change as more information comes out. So examples of where guidance has already changed is initially during the pandemic, we focused much more heavily on frequently touched surfaces and making sure that we're addressing those frequently touched surfaces. Now, over the course of the scientific evaluation of the virus, we have realized that while surface transmission can happen, it's not a super significant transmission vector, because you'd have to, end up touching that surface. You'd have to have enough of the virus on that surface to come in contact with your hand, and then your hand would then need to get into your eyes, nose, or mouth for you to actually contract the virus that way. So as a result, we now focus on, hand washing as a general practice, but surfaces are not a significant vector that we're going to focus on as much. On the flip side, during that same evaluation period, we also realized that masks are an effective way to help control the spread of COVID-19. So we went from the CDC saying there's no need to wear masks to now masks are pretty much required in a lot of places. And this thinking at the original point in time was that if you have a mask on, you're touching your face a lot more, so it almost is a unnecessary risk. And then we moved towards, all right, well, we know that the virus now spreads primarily through respiratory droplets, so a good way to address that is through wearing a mask. And that worked. Masks were shown to be much more effective at controlling the spread of COVID-19. So as science evolves, so will our practices and our policies and recommendations. And going forward, we already are facing and will continue to face the question about what about vaccinations and mask requirements specifically. So are we going to be scaling back requirements going forward? What will your facility change policy-wise? Will they still require masks? Will they require vaccination status in order for folks to not wear a mask? Or what will be the policy going forward? So it's important to note that, we do recognize that guidance will change on the horizon, but when you are changing your practices in your facility, it's important to communicate to the employees why, because like I said, these are all going to be controversial issues as folks have been involved in this pandemic now in both their working and personal lives for well over a year. So it's they're definitely getting pandemic fatigue, and communicating as clearly and consistently as possible about why you're doing things is important. And it's okay to acknowledge that we know more than we did before, and this is why the policy is changing, because we have access to new information. And that's okay to do, and that's what we would recommend doing, because people will recognize inconsistency and question you on it. So it's important to note that. And then it's also important to know your audience. So a lot of this comes back to having a strong COVID-19 control culture in the plant. But you may have an employee audience who is very unhappy with the current state of affairs. So if that's the case, you need to really understand the sentiments that could be contributing to that, or really understanding what specific issues they have with the policies that you're trying to enforce in order to control COVID-19. Because if you don't understand what the real issue is, then it's really, really hard to address it. And you want your workforce, to be happy, and you want to have a good culture, and you also want to be preventing a COVID-19 outbreak, because although things are a lot better, we're not quite out of the woods yet. So going forward, we're at the stage where the CDC guidance and state policies allow management team to make their own decisions on how to protect their workforce and business from COVID-19 outbreaks. So there's going to be a lot of decisions that you as a management team are going to need to be making in relation to what policies you're adopting and how you're communicating that. So definitely don't forget about the whole training piece of this. Don't just roll out a new policy without giving reasons why. Give those reasons why, because general fatigue over these changing procedures is certainly going to be a problem. And there's some people who are ready to ditch masks right now, and there's other people who are much more comfortable keeping them on. So no matter what direction you go in, you're going to be facing some questions from your employees. And whether they're voiced loudly or quietly, they will certainly have questions. And specific issues to evaluate on a facility and community-specific basis could include things like vaccination rates. So what is the vaccination rate in your employee population and in the general community population that your employees are coming from? And then, what does that mean for our mask adoption? Does that mean we're going to keep masks or not? The vaccination rate could depend on that. But you may be able to loosen up some policies if you have a high vaccination rate. So that's a decision that will need to be made on a facility-specific basis. And it's also important to point out that going back to this risk concept, vaccination immunity is not black and white. So vaccinations are a super tool in order to help, proactively prevent COVID-19. But that being said, it's not like if you have a vaccination, it's 100% immune. It's a sliding scale. It's going to be slightly different for different people. So it's important to point out that there is still some risk there. Not to say that vaccinations aren't well worth it. However, it's something to consider when we're evaluating our options. So take-home messages here. Industry is training to a moving target, and that will not change. So going forward, we're still going to be making changes as more information comes out. We're still learning about vaccines. There's questions of, will we need a booster? Will we need this and that? And that's all going to affect how we control for COVID-19 in the plant and our employee populations. General guidelines on training. Be consistent with how new policies are rolled out, and make sure that your management team is on the same page in the message and the reason why we've changed policies, and be as clear as possible. And then again, know your audience in the sense of what are they thinking and what do they need to fully understand this policy better, or how we came to this decision. So those are things to think about when you're developing your own internal COVID-19 training procedures and you're rolling out new policies as we continue to move through this pandemic. Thank you.